Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be welcoming this week on Monday morning with my old friend, Keith McCafferty, who's joining us. I love your hat. What's your hat?
This is actually a collector's item. It's a University of Montana fly fishing hat, which is sort of sacrilegious to wear here because we're at the rival town. So, but my daughter is a counselor at the University of Montana, so I do have a connection.
I see. All right. So you're not, well, I mean, I do think with all of us having, bushy hair and fancy hats and beards, my husband's growing a beard and a mustache, and I feel as though I'm being thrown back into the Victorian age.
Well, I have a hat for you. I just got up my Madison River Liars and Fly Tyers Club hats.
Excellent.
They're ordered. They haven't shown up yet. Uh-oh, my wife's locked herself out. Oh, no, there she is. Okay.
Well, I will certainly look forward to it. So one of the things that we want to talk about is your upcoming wonderful book. And it's named Bangtail is in the title. So what is the Bangtail fly?
A Bangtail Ghost, the word Bangtail in the old days meant a prostitute. It also is a horse that has his tail bobbed and cut straight across. That's called a bangtail. And then we also have a mountain range just north of town here called the Bangtail Mountains. And since part of the book, a small part of the book takes place up there, I chose that name, and as well because there's a prostitute who plays a part in this book. That's another reason I chose Bangtail.
I think the Bangtail Ghost is a wonderful title for a book. Now this is hard to make it show because unfortunately, or fortunately for me, this lovely fly that Keith has tied for me, the Bangtail Ghost, which comes with a special commemorative plate to Barbara Peters from Keith McCafferty. It's really hard to see it. Let me see if I can do this because of the glass. But he's a beautiful fly, and he has kind of a, I'm not sure it's purple, more of a mauve tail to him. Yeah. And of course, there's the fishing hook underneath him, which is what makes him stand on his beautiful plastic stand. So you are a real expert at tying flies, aren't you?
You know, I'm not a world-class tyer, but you know how it is when people get older. When you get older, the things you do for yourself or the things you do with your hands, you don't do it anymore. You no longer make a boat. You just get so busy doing other things. The one thing that I've kept at since I was a wee little boy is tying flies. So I still tie a lot of flies. And maybe it's a form of therapy, I don't know. But it reminds me of when I was a child. That particular fly is for catching steelhead or Atlantic salmon, and I've actually caught quite a few steelhead on it.
Is there a science behind tying flies? I mean, why is it that fishermen are so engaged and engrossed in this particular art form?
Because if you just take trout as an example, they eat a multitude, thousands of different kinds of insects and small bait fish and crayfish and everything else. And they are hardwired to key in on a particular food source when it's available. So let's say mayflies are hatching and floating down the river, and they've keyed in on them. You can present them with a fly that would give them much more nutrition and would be easy to catch, and they will ignore it because they've keyed in on that little insect. So the fly tyers and the fishermen, they're entomologists, and they learn how to tie the flies to imitate all the various forms of life, from larva to pupa to adult, for caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, and many other kinds. But back when I grew up and fished in Michigan, it was voodoo. It was more, guessing. Nobody knew anything. And I tied flies for an entire campground of fishermen. And when I was 7 years old, I tied for all of those old men. And they would, they'd say, I want a fly that looks like a baby grouse, because I caught a fish and it had a bird inside of it. Or one guy, Mason Bradley, caught a fish that had a vole inside of it, and he refused to eat it, but he wanted me to tie a fly that looked like a vole. So I tie all these crazy creations. That doesn't work anymore. The fish are too sophisticated for us.
When I think of fly fishing, I always think back to Scotland because the waters in Scotland are so full of fish and dedicated sportsmen, and they have a whole different um, property riparian,
That's
and
right.
water kind of laws than we
Yeah,
do, where people actually owned the river and the banks and therefore could uh, prohibit people from wading in and catching things. So am I right in thinking
There-
that
there-
Scotland is kind of the
yes,
birth of
more or
all?
less. It's an odd system where the crown still owns the fish that are in the river. The landowner has to have the rights to fish, or the landowner can't even fish there, let alone the public. So the odd thing about it is you or I could go there and we could stroll through the woods on somebody's property and go down and look at the river because you are allowed to trespass in Great Britain, which you're not allowed to do here. But we would have to pay whoever it is leases out the fishing, and that may or may not be the landowner. So it's a complicated system. It works in favor of not only very wealthy people, but people who have fishing rights going back 100 years or more, There are certain beats of the River Dee, say, where Prince Charles fishes. They're just gorgeous. But 3 or 4 people would have to die for a spot to open up, and then you could pay your £1,000,000 and fish.
Is
I
that,
fished in Scotland.
have you? It's
Yeah,
not, it's not just fish. That's also true of hunting rights. I know that they've always, in Scotland, they refer, I think it's August the 4th, they refer to it as the glorious 4th, because that's when the grouse season opens up and people,
that's right.
speaking of Victorian times, would go up and bag, just unbelievable numbers of birds, and obviously couldn't eat them all. But it was, again, a privilege to whoever owned the land, and he could either invite people or sell, or collect fees rather for letting people do that. So I find it really interesting. I edited a book a while back that had to do with property rights or public access on California beaches, and a Russian billionaire trying to fence off a stretch of the beach from the public and how you couldn't do that. So our country really has a different approach, doesn't it?
It has a different approach and it's not a universal approach. For example, Montana, we have any navigable river we are allowed to float, we are allowed to get out and wade, and we are allowed to walk along the bank within the high water mark. In Wyoming, the landowner not only owns his land, he owns the riverbed. Therefore, you can float the river, but you can't step out of the boat. And so one reason people talk about fishing in Montana more so than in Wyoming is not because the fishing is that much better in here, although we have more variety. It's largely because it's a public system in Montana with some rights reserved for people, the public, who to walk along the banks and fish, whereas that's simply not the case in Wyoming. And most states are sort of neither here nor there. It's a very dicey political issue, and you may think you have the rights, and somebody else will say you don't have the rights, and it'll end up going to court. Like California, and that happens more and more as wealthy people from larger centers of population move to areas where there are fewer people, like in Montana. We may have our stream access laws that protects us and gives us the right to walk that riverbank, but they will simply say, no, you can't, and throw lawyers at you, because they just want it for themselves.
Yes, well, the pandemic, I think, is accelerating the move of people from urban centers to more remote places to live full time. So I can
Yeah.
imagine that this is going to be a rising area of conflict about who gets to use land for what purpose.
Well, when I moved to Montana, most of the river valleys, the land was wholly or mostly owned by ranching families that went back generations. Today, you can go to that same river valley and there may not be one single significant landowner who is from in-state. The rest are from California or Santa Fe or largely out of the country. So it's changed dramatically.
So it's an interesting background for your series about Sean Stranahan. I mean, the books are not about fishing. They are actually wonderful thrillers with complicated and often devastating plots, may I say. Some of your plots are completely hair-raising. But in the background, there's always your fishing club, and Sean, who makes his living as a fishing guide, in addition to whatever detecting he does. So it's I think it's fascinating. You are able to bring in all these issues into the form of a thriller or detective story.
I like to say that in Montana, at least when I moved here, all walks of life walk together. There's so few people, you know, there were fewer than 1 million people in the entire state the size of California, that everybody knew each other. And people like C.J. Boxer, Craig Johnson write about these iconic lawmen in these great big vast wide open spaces in Wyoming counties, and that's viable because it's true. But the Montana that I moved to, we have a lot of those big ranches being divided up, and people from all stripes moving there. Are you okay there, Barbara?
Yep, I'm fine, thank you. I'm moving around a little bit. I am not actually in my library, nor is the dog, who you may have noticed hasn't moved since we started this. She's not alive.
I didn't say anything, but I noticed that the dog had not moved.
Yes, this is part of this interesting technology that you can do with Zoom. I could switch us to being on a beach with the surf rolling in and palm trees blowing, or blast us into outer space where we could see the northern lights or various other things. I think it's intriguing to be able to change the background so that we feel as though we are doing something different, even if we're just sitting in front of our desk.
He always does our Zoom meetings from Hawaii. You know, he's always dressed like, has the background of Hawaii. We have, like, you know, virtual cocktail hours and Jeopardy games every week with my family from all over the country. And that's a lot of fun. That's about all the social life we get out here right now. You know how it is.
It's basically all the social life we have in Scottsdale, but we're really fortunate. I think we're doing 43 virtual events, not counting these kinds of conversations in July. And many of them are with international authors. So while I really hate being disconnected from fans in the store and authors coming to visit, I have to say that at the moment we get to talk to a range of people that probably would not, I don't know why I say probably, certainly would not have come our way before we all mastered Zoom and had the leisure to spend time on it and to watch it. I don't know how long that will last, but I'm trying to see it as a positive in a time of numerous negatives.
Right. I mean, I'm starting to do a number of various Zoom. Crowdcast is another one that they use for book events. I just did a couple things, one with a man in Switzerland who is an editor of a French magazine. And, you know, he interviews me. Then he sends me back his interview in French, which I can't understand, but my wife can read it.
Oh, wonderful. So I gathered that you've got a fly tying apparatus there, and that you might show us, in fact, how you do this.
Well, this is in the books. There's a fly called Sam's Skinny Minnow, and named after my fishing guide character. And I started tying it here. It's the world's easiest fly to tie, and here we got it. And all I do now is I put a little bit of black marabou from marabou stork that sort of pulsates in the water. And I put that on top of the green one.
what have you inserted into this? It looks like a clamp. Is that what you're starting
Yeah,
with?
yeah, it's called a fly tying vise. And this is sort of a fancy looking one. I've got an old one that's about 50 years old that I use more often. And so you do what's called palmering. This is just called palmering, where I just wrap the feather around the hook. It's harder than it looks, actually. As many things are, especially as I get older, my hands are not what they used to be.
So is it the hook that is originally put into the vise and then you disguise the hook? Is that the process?
That's exactly it. You put the hook into the vise and then you tie onto what's called the shank of the hook. And that's what you tie onto. So now you see, I've got that Sam Skinny Minnow. And I actually have caught literally more than 1,000 fish on this particular fly. And
so how, on any particular day, Keith, how do you decide what fly you want to cast into the water, or do you take a range of flies with you and it's just kind of intuitive?
I take thousands of flies with me so that I can fail with 1,000 flies, you know. Yeah, because, you know, there can be different insects hatching at different times of the day, different phases of that insect. And like I said, the fish will key in on whatever is available that they can catch the easiest. And you may have 6 different flies that imitate a Brachycentrus caddis, but they all have their place. And then it's just sort of fun to carry all that around too. I don't know how I came up with the Madison River Liars and Fly Tyers Club, but that's the one I'm making hats to give to my readers.
Well, and fun. Sean owes his livelihood in part to the members of this club. There was a particular one that I really enjoyed, an older gentleman. He's been a part of the series.
Patrick Willoughby, who is the sort of the president. I took that name, and nobody has ever figured it out. I took that name from an old movie in the 1960s called Man's Favorite Sport that had Rock Hudson in it as a fisherman who sold fishing tackle for Abercrombie and Fitch or whatever in San Francisco, but had never actually fished himself. And so it's a comedy. It's an old thing. But his boss was a sort of a pudgy older man, and they called him Willoughby. And so that's where I took that from.
That is so funny. You know, I grew up north of Chicago in an area called the North Shore, which had several suburbs. And Rock Hudson, who grew up as Roy Fitzgerald, was my grandmother's mailman.
No kidding.
Before, he was a tall, skinny kid. Before he ever went to Hollywood and became Rock Hudson, he was Roy Fitzgerald carrying mail around Wilmette and Winnetka, Illinois. So, and my other, I actually went to high school and sang in a group with Ann Margaret, we were the same age, but I was a year ahead of her. And the worst fight I ever had with my mother was when I lent Ann a dress to sing in a concert, because she came from a very poor family. They
Sweden,
lived,
right?
Sorry?
She was from Sweden, wasn't she originally, Ann Margaret?
I'm trying to remember if it was Sweden or Norway, but her family lived behind the grand home of her mother's employer. Her mother worked as a housekeeper, and Annie went to New Trier with me, and we were both in a singing group, and she could not afford the formal dress that we had to wear for a concert. And my mother had a ban on my lending clothes. She was never a fan of, you know, how teenage girls like to swap clothes. So I had to smuggle my formal out of the attic and down there. And then I got into loads of trouble for it. It's a long story I won't go into. But even then, she had a wonderful stage personality, and you could tell that she might do very well. And I think I was a senior at Stanford the year she made her first movie. So it wasn't all that long after we sang together in high school in the ensemble that she went to Hollywood. I don't recall the arc of Rock Hudson's career. I just remember the whole thing about him carrying the mail. So And then his life became more unexpected than we all dreamed, because he wasn't able to come out in Hollywood then as
Sure.
he might
Right.
have today. So he was a romantic lead, often with, I think, Doris Day and other people. So his
Right.
whole life is a really fascinating arc, which has nothing to do with you except you
Well,
raised the name.
here's something that has nothing to do with it either, but my parents grew up across the alley from Dean Martin in Steubenville, Ohio. And they had their hair cut by old Mr. Crescetti, Dean Martin's father. And when my grandmother and her sister came west on vacation, they stopped and stayed at Dean Martin's parents' house, and they got to go on the set of a movie called Circus Circus that Dean Martin made with Zsa Zsa Gabor. I have home movies of Dean Martin.
Isn't it funny how we can remember brushes with people who turned out to be celebrities, and then we probably had reams of absolutely amazing classmates who went on to do astonishing things that we've completely forgotten. But that's how it is. I can't get my head around the whole term Instagram influencer today. Is a career path is something I just can't really relate to. But it's surprising how celebrity has wandered off into new channels as technology has allowed that to happen. It used to be the movies were like the peak, right?
Right.
The number one thing, but today there are all kinds of other roads to it. So Sean, we haven't mentioned exactly where you are in Montana. You might want to orient us a little bit.
Well, he's in a fictional town named Bridger, which is in my area, which is roughly Ennis, Bozeman, Three Forks area of Montana. I may have made a little mistake in that there is a teeny town called Bridger, which is farther east in Montana. I thought, well, nobody's going to care because nobody knows that town. But of course, a few people know that town, and they let you know. I don't think logistically he could drive there in an hour and a half.
Well, Montana certainly has a number of disproportionate high number of writers to the size of the population. Maybe living isolated encourages that.
Right, and there's a rivalry, between the writers in eastern Montana and the writers in western Montana, propagated by the people in western Montana who think they're far superior to us.
I didn't know that. Wow. So, and interestingly enough, I used to love Peter Bowen. I still do love them. Peter Bowen, who died recently, wrote some wonderful books set in Montana with the Métis Indians and talked about Montana as a border state, and how artificial boundaries sliced right through the Métis Nation, and they tried to disregard that. And then just last week, we talked to Paul Doiron, who writes in Maine.
I know.
And he too went up to, I think his books are wonderful. It has the new story, The Last to Die, moves up on the Maine border and again talks about the same thing, the movement of the Métis and the Acadians back and forth across the St. John River, and how a closed border, such as we're having currently, when Canada and the United States used to have the longest unprotected border in the world, but now it's all slammed shut. And how ruinous that has been to these cultures and communities that have, freely gone back and forth. It's the same thing as it is in the southern United States, but we tend to think of the South, in Arizona anyway, we think of the southern border a lot more than we think of the northern border.
And that reminds me of, Chief Joseph's great military retreat that took him hundreds of miles as they were chased by the U.S. cavalry. And he was within a few miles of taking his people into Canada when they were finally captured. And he wrote that great speech about it.
So the Bangtail Ghost, give us a quick little preview, because we'll be back talking to you together with the Ghost, and I think it's August 18th, your publication day. So we'll have a little party when we too can have cocktails while we're talking.
Right, all right, good. Well, all my life I've been fascinated by cats. And when I wrote one of my earlier books, I was invited to the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana to read and to sell books. And they said, oh, there'll be lots of people there because, you have lots of fans up here. So I have to go through the big rigmarole of going through the gate. You get fingerprinted, you know, photographed. They lead me to the commissary. They've got banners 10 feet wide with my name on them. And I go in there and think, well, I'm going to sell a lot of books. And the place is deserted, and it stays deserted. I ended up selling a number of books anyway, but I couldn't figure it out. The guy kept telling me, I'm really sorry about this. Well, then he finally came to me and he said, well, we have a remain in place order throughout the base. Nobody can leave wherever they are because there's a mountain lion has been spotted on the base. They had an armed guard take me from the commissary to get into my car, and then they led me in a convoy to like a secret entrance place where I could leave. The whole military base was shut down. This is a military base that has enough ordnance to, you know, to conquer a European nation in about 5 minutes or start World War III. And it was brought to a screeching halt by a cat. A screeching halt. They finally found the poor mountain lion, you know, hiding in a culvert pipe and killed it the next day. I was, of course, on the side of the mountain lion. And so I always wanted to write something about how people react to predators who may occasionally show us that we are not the apex predator that we think we are, where we might be on the menu once in a while. And I wanted it to write it, you know, as a mystery. It's like, well, what's really happening? What's going on behind these deaths? Is it really attributed to animals, or is it something else? And so that's what I did. At first I had a lot of stuff about India in it, but that was all taken out. As books do.
I can't wait to read it. Unfortunately, one of the artifacts of this pandemic is that publishers are having a hard time sending out advanced reading copies. So I will.
Well, I was told that. I talked to Victoria there, and she said, well, I said, well, I never got an advanced reading copy. She said, well, nobody did. You know, they didn't do them. But they did get the books out to, you know, get reviewed. I know that.
Well, right. I can't do these kinds of conversations intelligently or do you authors justice if I haven't read the story, but I will find a way, Keith, to have read the Bangtail Ghost before we talk on August 18th, I promise.
And thank you very much for, I've got all the information that you're going to send books here, or they're going to send books here, and I'm going to send them on to you. Whenever
we have an unbroken record of doing your books, signing your books, talking about your books.
That's right.
I am such a.
It's the only place. You're the only place. I mean,
really?
With unbroken record, and then you have the full set of flies too.
I really treasure my complete set of flies. Absolutely, I'm going to add this to it. And we've also done some interesting events with other authors. Nevada Bar being one, and I'm trying to remember. We did do one with Linda Castillo, didn't we, together?
Yes, and with CJ Box and with Nevada.
Right. Well, Linda, tonight we are doing her virtual launch, and she is home in Texas instead of here, which we're both sad about. But we have another of her Amish community thriller. This one, interestingly, Keith, is a real thriller. Normally, they're police procedurals, but in this one, she's instead of a procedural, which is a whole different structure for a book, it's definitely a thriller with corrupt cops from nearby Columbus.
She sets her books not too awful far from where I grew up. I grew up in Amish Country, so I'd had that.
About that. That's right.
Yeah, we were about 15 miles from the Amish Country in Steubenville. It was farther to the west. And one of the strangest things when I was a kid is when the crappies were running in the lake, fish, you know, we would drive to Tappan Reservoir and rent a rowboat to fish. And as we did that, the Amish would be coming from the opposite direction in their horses and buggies, and they would rent a motorboat. And I always thought, wait, that doesn't compute.
I'll certainly bring that up this evening, talking to Linda.
Yeah,
I love it.
Here, we were the backward people out there on the lake, and they were the more, you know, advanced technology, the Amish.
There must be some sort of rationale for the motorboat, who knows?
There must be.
But anyway, her book is called The Outsider, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it with her as I am with you. So I want to thank you for spending a little, excuse me, a little time with me and
Well, thank you
Nala the
for
dog.
inviting me.
You bet. And I will look forward to talking to you in August. In the meantime, I'm going to add my beautiful Bangtail Ghost fly
All
to
right.
my collection of Keith McCafferty flies. Someday we'll have to do a program with all of the flies. I'll try to figure it out, but I'd have to take the glass off in order for people to.
Well, I finally started gluing them because they, people would take the glass off and then the glass would shatter. I didn't want to hurt somebody.
No, I understand that. It's just that the light bounces off the glass dome and makes it extremely difficult to display.
You're right. You're
but
right.
we'll figure out something. Anyway, enjoy your summer, and I will talk to you in August, okay?
All right. We'll talk soon. It's nice seeing
Bye.
you, Barbara. Bye-bye.